Welcome to this latest edition of our Workbench blog and all the news, updates and modelling exclusives from the fascinating world of Airfix. We're excited to be back in the fascinating territory of new kit additions to the current Airfix range in this latest edition of Workbench, or to be precise, the actual design of them, as we bring you details of a project which is literally out of this world. In this latest designer interview edition, we will be featuring the new SLS Artemis kit in 1/144th scale, our latest space exploration-related kit addition to the range, and our scale tribute to NASA's current high-tech space launch system. When you need a designer of some industries standing to cope with demanding situations such as these, we're lucky to have just the man for the job, and you'll be pleased to hear that Workbench regular Paramjit Sembhi will be in our hot seat again this time around, as we review what must have been quite the significant design challenge for him. Just as was the case with Ethan Barker over the previous 2 weeks, and the Westland Wessex being his first helicopter design project, so SLS Artemis was Paramjit's first foray into the world of spacecraft kit design, and that being the case, we had plenty of poignant questions lined up to ask him. As you would expect, we also requested a selection of supporting imagery to illustrate some of the points covered, and Paramjit didn't let us down. We're all in for a real design treat. We continue exploring the latest kit additions to the current Airfix range as we go interstellar in this latest edition of Workbench. Whether you would describe yourself as a space exploration enthusiast or just someone with a passing interest, it's no exaggeration to say that space launch vehicles and the launch sequence itself is without doubt one of the most spectacular sights a human being could ever witness, with the awesome power possessed by these launch systems surely representing the very pinnacle of man's technical ingenuity. Even though most of us will have only ever watched such a spectacle from the comfort of our own homes via a TV screen, they have always managed to leave a significant impression on the vast majority of the world's population, along with an enduring fascination for anything connected with space, be that the sight of stunning astrophotography or spacecraft models and collectibles. Indeed, for those people who witnessed the moon landings during the summer of 1969, the events of that particular year will no doubt be remembered as one of the most significant in their lives, as the world watched in amazement and disbelief as the crew of Apollo 11 set foot on the surface of the moon and made their "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind" quote, whilst at the same time proclaiming America as the lead player in this incredible space race. This fascination continued throughout the 20th century and onward into the 2000s as spacecraft became ever more capable and the technologies employed even becoming reusable as scientists managed to develop materials which could withstand the incredible heat and punishing forces they were subjected to during the launch procedure. Over recent years, space exploration appears to have taken on a renewed sense of importance and once again has the world watching in awe as the latest craft in this wider program are assembled on their launch platforms prior to making their attempt to break free from the grasp of Earth's gravitational hold. In propelling astronauts and new technologies towards the stars, we're all now fully aware that much of the technology used during these latest attempts will no doubt find its way into our everyday lives in the years to come, which is just one more reason as to why space exploration as a subject continues to hold such enduring fascination for millions of people, and that's without referring to Captain James T. Kirk even once. Even as we write this latest blog, another SpaceX test launch has been successfully undertaken, as man's quest to explore and conquer outer space continues with the renewed impetus we mentioned earlier, bringing with it the promise of more spectacular launch events for us all to marvel at. Allowing a new generation of the Earth's population to witness the development and impressive achievements of a NASA space program, the Space Launch System is their latest and most powerful rocket launch system to date, one intended to take mankind back to the surface of the moon and beyond. The latest generation of super heavy lift launch vehicle, to the uninitiated, SLS and the Orion spacecraft capsule almost appears to be a combination of both Apollo and space shuttle technologies. However, this incredible program does represent the absolute pinnacle of engineering technology and the means by which man will venture deeper into space than ever before. Blasting off for an unmanned maiden launch on the 16th of November 2022, the first manned launch is planned for 2025, when the Orion capsule will embark on a lunar flyby, the precursor to man's return to the surface of the Moon and deeper space exploration to follow. As some of the most incredible machines ever conceived by man, which also support some of man's most significant achievements, scale model kit representations of various spacecraft have been a feature of many an Airfix model range over the years, with 2025 marking a significant chapter in this continuing story. Thinking back to the incredible achievements of the summer of 1969, it will come as absolutely no surprise to Workbench readers to learn that those historic events also stimulated significant tooling investment in several new space-related kit projects for the Airfix range, with no fewer than 5 new space-related kit figure releases, all joining the range the following year. With space being the topic on everybody's lips back then, these kits were both impressive in size and proved incredibly popular as modelers were desperate to get hold of them, and enthusiasts introduced to the hobby for the first time as a result of their release. Kits such as the Soviet Vostok 1, Saturn 1B, Saturn V, and Apollo 11. Lunar Module all joined the range in 1970, along with a set of astronaut figures, with the Space Shuttle kit joining this initial collection towards the end of the decade. Even James Bond got in on the Space Shuttle action. With new tooling additions to the Space Kit range being but a light speck in a distant galaxy over recent years, the impending release of our new 1/144th scale SLS Artemis kit is quite a big deal for us here at Airfix, and an opportunity for modelers everywhere to reconnect with the subject of space exploration and modelling projects which possess huge appeal, making for some of the most spectacular centerpiece displays any collection of built models could possibly boast. In situations like this, you need to call upon the talents of a special breed of human being, a man who's our very own astronaut in waiting, and someone who will never shirk a design challenge, no matter how stellar that challenge may be, Commander Paramjit Sembhi. Clearly this was going to be a very different project for Paramjit to take on, so we wanted to find out when he actually started Project Artemis and what information he inherited as part of his brief/research files. He told us that this project was started back in November 2023, and how he actually inherited a wealth of material with which to get started. One of the most memorable aspects he recalls of this entire project was how other members of the design team appeared to be just a tad envious that he was handed this project, and how he actually felt quite privileged to be handed this design responsibility. As part of the team, I myself remember being present in development meetings where each individual designer would take their turn to update the group on the current status of their assigned projects. Obviously, each and every presentation was fascinating in its own right, with team members being invited to offer suggestions as to how best to overcome particular issues a designer may have come across whilst working on their latest project, as each will probably have a slightly different way of addressing the same problem. As fascinating as this was, I definitely noticed something of a change in the room dynamics when Paramjit started telling the group about the status of his SLS Artemis project, and significantly, what he was hoping to achieve with his design. Everyone was so attentive, and it seemed as if everyone in the room wanted to have some influence, no matter how small, on the design of this impressive new kit. From a personal interest perspective, Paramjit also told us that he's always had an interest in spacecraft, and has several model builds already under his belt, and a fine collection of space-related models in his own collection, so this was definitely a project he was extremely keen to take on. With regard to the information he inherited, we were quite surprised to learn that Paramjit actually received a great deal of information at the outset of the project, including really excellent CAD data supplied by NASA themselves and a swollen research folder full of images. He described how the CAD data was much more accurate than the scan data he would usually be presented with at this initial stage, as NASA had already completed the cleanup work, and what Paramjit was actually working with were mature files, with no grey areas or misscans included. Everything was really good and provided him with the confidence he needed to get started straight away. During the initial design phase, Paramjit also told us that he and the lead researcher created a huge folder of detailed photographs covering every aspect of the launch system's design, using details taken from the NASA website and other images taken from various related websites. All in all, when it came to starting the design of this significant new project, Paramjit was definitely not left in the dark. Our second question is usually an opportunity for the designer to tell us how valuable it was for him to inspect a preserved example of the subject being covered in this project, and how the trip aided with both the representation of detail and overall design reassurance throughout the project. In this case, however, when we asked Paramjit if he had been given the opportunity to inspect one of these super heavy lift rockets in person, he simply replied, "I wish." Well, as answers go, that was definitely a little shorter than we're used to. We knew we were going to have much more success with our next question. As this was Paramjit's first space-related design project, we wanted to know how different a challenge it was from the design projects he had already taken on during his Airfix career. Right from the outset, Paramjit knew that this was going to be a very different project to what he had worked on previously, but how his growing experience immediately told him where the potential problems lay and how he would most likely overcome them. Whilst not usually restricted on the number of parts when working on any new design project, unless it's something like a starter set kit or quick build model, every designer knows what's sensible and what isn't, not just from a tooling cost perspective, but also in relation to assembly integrity and modular build enjoyment. That being the case, his most significant initial challenge was understanding what needed to be included and how everything was going to come together. As this new kit would be presented in rather a large box, there wasn't really a concern about the size of individual parts, although having said that, there are self-imposed sensibility constraints to consider. The design split would have to conform to the actual stages of the launch system itself, with some of the propulsion and fuel sections being quite large pieces, but with quite a significant amount of detailing and assembly integrity thinking required in relation to the top Orion spacecraft stage components. As the launch system blasts into space, the solid rocket boosters are designed to separate from the rest of the craft when their burn cycle is completed, with the Artemis system having 3 main separation stages. Therefore, one of Paramjit's major concerns was how he was going to design the split of the parts and how everything would come together during assembly. The sections of the rocket which come apart in flight had to also come apart on the new kit, but how everything assembled securely on the completed model without the need to use glue on parts which were never intended to be fixed. It was that age-old designer's quandary of not overcomplicating the design without making it too simple an assembly task. Right from the outset, Paramjit knew that some of the major component elements of the design were going to be quite large pieces, and whilst his clear intention was to include as much surface detail as he could on these parts, a major concern for him was around how these larger parts would come together securely during assembly. Working closely with the toolmaker, he deviated from his usual pin and socket locator assembly design, and instead created longer tabs, which would provide a much more secure fix during the assembly process, providing the modeler with much greater certainty during construction. This also virtually eliminated any risk of sink marks becoming a problem during the manufacturing stage of the new kit. At this point, Paramjit informed us that during the design phase of this project, he realized that a section of the main core stage booster featured some very subtle bulges which needed to be replicated, the discovery of which had him going back through his research files to check the very latest updates on the actual SLS design. Although in this scale the bulges were almost indiscernible to the naked eye, they were on the actual spacecraft, and he was therefore determined to have them as part of his own design. At this stage, we also wanted to ask Paramjit about the design of one of the most important features of the entire kit, and at what stage this became a concern for him: the display base. He informed us that as the scale of this new kit was never up for discussion, and how it was always going to be in 1/44th scale, he knew this was going to be quite a large kit featuring larger components, and how the finished model would need to sit securely on a relatively small display base. Other than the fact that this was going to have to be a robust single-piece item, there really wasn't that much else to consider. All the design elements would actually be usual fare for an Airfix designer, other than again working closely with the toolmaker to discuss how to make the part rigid enough for intended use, but not a problem during tooling or eventual kit production. From a design perspective, Paramjit wanted to incorporate as many design elements from the real launch pad as he could, knowing that his design would have to be significantly smaller, not just in scale, than the actual pad, and how his had to interact with the openings on the booster engine openings to allow for the secure, vertical display of the finished model. Although we thought the design creation of this base location would be crucial and therefore extremely difficult to achieve, Paramjit informed us that it was actually quite easy, with the design of male and female location points really just being down to good design experience and not challenging at all. What he did say, though, was that this all fed into the overall importance of design rigidity and the need for the built kit to be a rigid structure, with no warp whatsoever and very little flexing. Next, we moved on to the subject of actual design challenges, and if anything had Paramjit heading back into design software to make changes later in the process. He told us that other than designing internal support sections to help with providing the necessary strength for the completed kit, the only thing that really had him heading back into design was the relationship between the top Orion spacecraft design section and how this locked into position on the main launch system core stage. As this would be a user-detachable option on the finished kit, clearly glue would not be an option when assembling this part, so Paramjit designed a series of locking pegs which would allow this top section to be twisted securely into place when offering it into the launch vehicle stage adapter ring at the top of the core stage. As the part twisted securely into place, this would have to align perfectly with how the Orion aligns on the actual spacecraft, but when testing and assembling the prototype 3D printed components he had produced, Paramjit didn't feel this system worked quite as well as he had intended. This saw him returning to his CAD files and making some subtle but very important changes to this section of his design, something he now thinks works really well and will be one of the most appealing features of the new kit. Again, as a designer's experience continues to evolve, diving back into CAD during a design are usually when a designer wants to make the modeler experience more pleasurable throughout the assembly process and to include innovation into any new design project. With the new kit only featuring 79 parts, it was always going to be the case that many of them were going to be quite large, much bigger than on most kit design projects, so we wanted to ask Paramjit if this aspect of the design caused him any problems at all. He told us that whilst this was clearly a major design consideration, it wasn't really anything too taxing from a design representation perspective, and in some respects he actually over-strengthened the design, if there could ever be such a thing. The larger parts were all designed with strengthener rib and former sections on the inside of each part, all of which, whilst being hidden once assembled, endowed the overall design with great strength and the rigidity this large kit required. In addition to this, the main core stage of the SLS features internal rings to give the structure that same rigidity, but also provide the modeler with confidence during the assembly process, ensuring that everything goes together exactly as intended, with great inherent strength, retaining absolute shape integrity. Also, despite the fact that all of this strengthening work was a feature of the internal structure of the kit, an SLS Artemis does feature quite a lot of essential surface detailing, something which also had to be replicated in design on the kit. This had to be done in such a way that the raised sections didn't create problems during manufacture, because there were already raised section on the internal sections of the design, but did have to remain faithful to a craft which is probably going to become one of the most famous machines on Earth in the not-too-distant future. The only way Paramjit could replicate this detail to his satisfaction was to include them as separately designed parts. End. Even though the overall part count on this kit is quite low, he told us that there are actually quite a few of these separate detail parts within the design, something he thinks gives this new kit real presence and character. Paramjit told us that in hindsight, some of his strengthening measures were probably a little over the top, and as his internal strengthening design on the larger components would have been enough by themselves, how he's still glad he incorporated the other elements, because the overall feel with this build is one of great strength and rigidity, something he thinks modelers will come to appreciate. Although the subject itself dictated that this was never going to be a particularly complicated kit from an assembly perspective, Paramjit feels that the entire build goes together in a simple, logical manner, but what you end up with is a really impressive kit from a sheer size perspective, and one which modelers of all experience levels will be able to tackle with relative ease. Once assembled and placed on its display base, this mighty spaceship will definitely look like it's ready for blast-off. We always like to end our designer interviews with a little quickfire questioning round, where we hit our people with a series of questions requiring only short, snappy answers, but not giving them too much time to think. In this way, we think the answers will take them straight back to the time they spent on the subject under review, and allow us a clear indication of what they thought of the project as a whole, design, warts and all, so to speak. All the questions begin with, from a design perspective, what aspect of the new kit's design would you say proved to be? And then the question, so here goes. Firstly, the most challenging aspect, Paramjit said this was definitely the upper stage design, or to be technically correct, the Orion spacecraft section. Whilst this was still essentially a cylinder from a design perspective, it actually incorporates quite a lot of external detail and still needed that all-important strengthening design work discussed earlier. Also, this was the section which required the twist lock mechanism design, something which saw Paramjit returning to his CAD files to make some slight modifications. Next, we wanted to know which was the most time-consuming. Surprisingly, going off the size of the parts, he again offered the Orion spacecraft section design as his answer, and as he was already expecting the next question, we didn't challenge and simply moved on. How about the most frustrating element? Again, Paramjit offered the Orion spacecraft section of the design, but a very specific part of it, the ICPS. Clearly, this had us immediately diving onto the internet to find out what he meant, so as not to appear too thick, where we found that it is, of course, the interim cryonic propulsion stage, which is the final thrust element of the craft to get the crew and service modules into correct orbit. Paramjit described how there is a lot of detail to be incorporated into a relatively small area of the design here. He pointed out the series of X-frame structures which form part of the design of the lower section of this stage, and he described how these proved to be a bit of a nightmare. With detail on the parts themselves and stuff going on above, below and behind them, this definitely provided the project's head-scratching moments and did take quite a while to replicate to his satisfaction. It's probably also the most thought-provoking part of the assembly process as a consequence, but certainly nothing for modelers to be concerned about. What proved to be the most rewarding? In addition to the overall presence this new kit possesses, Paramjit described how he thought the separate detail parts which make up the core stage propulsion unit proved to be a particularly rewarding aspect for him, as this external pipework adds real depth to the build and takes the kit in an appealing direction when it comes to visual appeal. Again, creating a few design challenges for him along the way, these features provide the kit with real character and help to give it tons of presence when finished and on display. What do you think modelers will appreciate most about the new kit? With questions such as these, we would normally expect Paramjit to draw reference from his own vast modelling experience when working on his own designs, something which has to be a huge benefit to the wider hobby as a consequence. Having built many a spaceship model kit himself over the years, he already knew the design elements he would have done differently had he been involved in the design of those kits, and SLS Artemis presented him with the opportunity to do just that. In addition to creating a kit, which was both an enjoyable build and one which looked spectacular when on display, he was thinking about the usual concerns a modeler has when working through a new kit build and how he could make that journey easier and more enjoyable. With the painting of space-related kits being such an important feature of the overall presentation when completed, he wanted to support this by designing his kit in logical sections, creating sub-assembly sections which conformed with the paint demarcations of those individual sections. This would not only support the feeling of being a much more logical build from the modeller's perspective, but would also provide convenience from a painting perspective, meaning that sub-assemblies which all required the same paint colours could easily be painted as the build progressed, without impinging on other elements of the build. Paramjit told us that if he was building the kit, this would be the most logical and convenient way for him to do it, so this therefore had to be a feature of his design. On to our final two questions now, and we wanted to ask Paramjit what he recalls as being the most memorable aspect of the time he spent on this project. Quick as a flash, he said, "My trip to America to see one of these magnificent machines, not. It's probably best if we move on swiftly." And finally, as he'd now ticked a space exploration design project off his Airfix bucket list, we wanted to ask him if there was a particular project he'd love to take on at some point during his Airfix career. We know he has a love for large-scale warship kits, so did expect him to offer something like that, but he actually said a classic World War II fighter aircraft in 1/24th scale. He didn't elaborate with regard to a particular aircraft type. However, he did go on to say that these are some of the most impressive and highly regarded kits in the hobby, and he would certainly like the opportunity to take on this responsibility at some point. From a workbench and indeed a wider hobby perspective, we really can't wait for that to happen and look forward to bringing you all the details when it does. We would like to thank Paramjit for committing so much of his valuable time with us this week and for helping us to put this review feature together, because without him, it just wouldn't be the same. The new kit looks truly spectacular, and when we all start building our own example, hopefully the details PJ provided here will help to give us all a greater appreciation of the many hours he spent designing this kit to ensure we enjoyed our time with it. SLS Artemis represents a new chapter in manned space exploration, one which will hopefully see man returning to the surface of the moon once more after more than half a century. When we eventually witness all this incredible drama unfolding on our TV screens, Paramjit will be able to say to his friends and family, "I designed that." Well, at least in scale kit form anyway. We're sure he would also hope that many of us will have prepared for that day by spending time with his latest kit design, something which he is extremely proud of being associated with. The newly tooled Airfix 1/144th scale SLS Artemis kit is available now, and as a gift set release is supplied complete with paints, paintbrushes and polycement, everything you might need for modelling blast-off. We are afraid that's all we have for you in this latest edition, but we will be back next Friday with more project development updates and the very latest Airfix kit exclusives. In the meantime, we are always keen to hear your views on all things Airfix, and in particular, any thoughts and opinions you may have regarding our Workbench blog. If you would like to drop us a quick line, could we please ask that you use our workbench at airfix.com email for all correspondence. To revisit any of the Airfix blogs we have produced over the past 7 years or so, please head to our main Workbench hub, where you will find our entire blog, back catalogue, and all the Airfix design projects we have already covered. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, feel free to follow and rate us 5 stars if you've enjoyed. We'll see you next week for another installment of Workbench. This podcast audio was generated by AI using text written by a human.